Mrs. S here, hoping to make your job a little bit easier as I teach the teach. Today's topic is the intro to The Crucible by Arthur Miller. There's so much history going on behind Arthur Miller's The Crucible that I really like to, before I even open the book and tell the kids about the play, that I like to go through and talk about the history. So let's jump in. Arthur Miller is an American playwright and essayist. He wrote Death of a Salesman, which goes on Broadway in 1949 and runs for about a year and wins tons of awards. So Arthur Miller is just gaining steam as the calendar turns 1950 as a very influential writer, playwright. He's gaining fame a little bit. In 1953, he releases his story, his play, The Crucible, which is a dramatization of the 1692 Salem witchcraft trials. And what ended up happening was that it was an allegory for something called McCarthyism. So this is where we kind of switch over to the history of what was going on in America, why Arthur Miller was writing The Crucible, and what his intentions were, kind of. So McCarthyism is started about 1950, and it was also referred to as the Red Scare, and it was about communism. There were rumors, and people believed that the communists had infiltrated American government, and they were not excited about that. American ideals were very anti-communism, and so the idea that someone would infiltrate our government and try to lead us in that direction was really worrisome. So Senator Joseph McCarthy was chosen he sort of set himself up to be the guy who would go after and seek, investigate who were the communists. And so he set himself up as the chairman of a committee. It was called the House of Un-American Activities Committee, or the HUAC. And their job was to find out if someone was communist and remove them from government positions. And so what ended up happening as the 1950s progressed is that the investigations were not necessarily fact-finding. A lot of what was happening was, we think this guy's a communist, so we're going to question him, and if he doesn't have the exact right answers, we're going to hold him for being suspected of being a communist and not let him do his job. And so a lot of people were blacklisted, and that included Hollywood, which is kind of a crazy angle to throw, because right around this time, Arthur Miller divorces his first wife and marries Marilyn Monroe, like the Marilyn Monroe. And so there, Arthur Miller is being thrown into spotlight in Hollywood, and he's looking around and he's seeing a lot of what's happening to his colleagues, to his friends, to people in the government, as the McCarthyism is coming after them, essentially. If you were suspected of communism by doing anything, you were arrested and brought before the committee, and you were questioned. And if your name was listed, you basically were more than likely found guilty, and if you weren't found guilty, your name was tainted to be communist for forever. And so it wasn't a great time to be on the wrong side of things, so to speak. So the McCarthyism, the scare about communism, was rooted in something actually factual. There probably were communists trying to infiltrate America. We were involved in a Korean War. There was activity in China and East Europe, and the communist movement was trying to kind of push over. And President Truman at one point had said we lost China as far as like getting their government to turn around. And so a lot of people were really scared of communism in America. And so that was founded in the truth. But what happened with McCarthyism is that they weren't looking for the truth. They were just looking for people to blame. And so they brought you into the committee asked you questions. If they didn't like the way that you answered them, you were held, until they could figure out what they were going to do with all these communists. So they looked at Senator McCarthy as a protector of the American ideal, he targeted leftists and intellectuals and artists specifically, as you go through history and look at who goes down. And what's interesting is Arthur Miller is on that list. So what I do with the kids, side note, what I do with the kids is we are circled up to read the Crucible. I put them in a giant circle in my classroom, and we're circled up. And so I walk around the center of the circle, and I'm like, are you or have you ever been affiliated with a Communist Party? And I'll just ask a kid. And the kid will say no. And I'm like, okay, go sit in jail for a while until you change your mind. And then I go to the next kid, and I'm like, are you or are you not affiliated with a Communist Party? So of course the next kid's like, yes. And it's like, okay, great, jail. And then I go to the next kid, and I'm like, are you or are you not affiliated with the Communist Party? And this kid's looking around, and I'll whisper to them or say something and say, refuse to answer. And so then we do one where they refuse to answer, and I'm like, okay, well, you're held in contempt of court, go to jail. And they're like, wait, everybody went. And I was like, yeah, it's a little exaggerated, but it gets them thinking about, where was the truth in that? And so I tell them that that's what happened to Arthur Miller. In 1950, Arthur Miller, so backing up to Arthur Miller, is watching the Red Scare take root in America, and it made him uncomfortable. He says in his essay, Why I Wrote the Crucible, that many were fearful, and with good reason, of being identified as a covert communist if they should protest too strongly. Like if you were going to say, hey, McCarthy, why don't you slow down and actually find out what's the truth about these people, then he would just bring you in and question you. So it was a sticky situation. So this affected Hollywood greatly. People even began to have to be cleared before they could be employed. So that meant that they had to make sure you weren't communist before you could even be employed somewhere. And so that really starts to affect a lot of what was going on. So too cautious to write about the present conflict. Arthur Miller is like, I can't write about this communist stuff, I'll get arrested that fast. He is seeking for new ideas. He reads a book by Charles W. Upham. It was published in 1867. This guy was the mayor of Salem and sort of tells the story about the Salem witchcraft trials. And Arthur Miller's like, oh my gosh, wait a minute, this sounds so familiar, except for it's not 1950, it's 1692. So Arthur Miller goes to Salem, Massachusetts, and actually reads the actual transcripts from Salem's courthouse in 1692. And he reads the entire thing, and he is amazed at the correlations between the Salem witchcraft trials, the witch hunts, and McCarthyism, or the Red Scare. And that was that. He was like, I have to write this play. So he's dramatizing the Salem witchcraft trials, but really hinting at this is what's happening in America in 1952. He began to draw all those similarities between 1692 and 1952, and he tells the story. One thing that's interesting is that Arthur Miller revolves the Crucible around a character, John Proctor, who is not at all morally sound, and yet the only voice of reason. And so Arthur Miller really taps into that idea that if we're going to repeat history, are we going to keep repeating history? And so every time I get to read the Crucible, I pick a current event and I ask, did they find the facts or did they assume the worst? And are they on a witch hunt just for people to blame or for people to take the fall for something? And so it's really relevant every year that I read it. And sometimes I use different things. And sometimes the kids will come up and they'll say, it's kind of like this. And so it's really, really important for them to understand that Arthur Miller wrote the Crucible as in a response to something that was happening later in 1950s that was mirroring what was happening back in the Salem witchcraft trials. And so as they start to read it, they really start to see it. Another fun fact that I tell them is that Arthur Miller was called, after his play releases, he was called to the committee, and he refused to go. And he refused to cooperate, and they were like, well, just give us the names of your friends who are communists. And Arthur Miller refused. And so he was held in contempt of Congress, and it was a big deal. And in the end, 2 years after it was thrown out, and McCarthyism finally does dissipate once they finally stop. One of McCarthy's interviews was recorded for television. And once everybody sort of saw what was going on, they were like, wait. And McCarthyism fell out of favor. He ended up being stripped of his title, and he goes back home, and he ends up dying shortly after the whole ordeal. And the hunt for communists sort of slows down, and everything, it doesn't go back to normal, but a lot of people who were in trouble before kind of got released, and Arthur Miller goes on to write more plays. So that is the heads up on what's going on all behind the Crucible. So when you open the first few pages and he starts talking about communism and those kinds of things, it sort of starts to make sense when you understand that Arthur Miller was personally involved in the McCarthyism and the Red Scare. And he ended up better for it, and we got the Crucible out of it. Thanks for watching.